It is March of 1944. Bud Anderson, as part of the 357th Fighter Group, is a flight leader taking on the Germans in the air battle over Europe. In his P-51, named Old Crow, he has one confirmed kill to his credit. But it has been no walk in the park. There have been many losses of good men, and the Germans are not going down easy. Getting his first kill just a few days earlier, the young Captain Anderson was on a high, but yet again, he would be brought down quickly. On March 22nd, after many days of hard combat, Anderson had a routinely scheduled day off. As was common during this time, another young pilot took his aircraft Old Crow on the mission. For the second time in just 1 month, his fighter would not come back home. Lieutenant Carter Jones, another young pilot in the 357th, was shot down on his way back from Berlin. He would become a POW. Now, the young Bud Anderson would be assigned a new Mustang, but fortunately, this one would last him a while. This P-51 would be given the checkered board pattern on the nose and the large Old Crow lettering by the exhaust, creating undoubtedly the most famous version of his aircraft. According to his book, To Fly and Fight, he told his crew to paint the letters big on the aircraft this time around, jokingly saying that it might get them more customers. In addition, after the events thus far, he would also have to try to be a little bit more picky about who was allowed to fly his plane, hopefully eliminating another aircraft loss. But the losses would still come in other ways. It was simply unavoidable. On the 29th of March of 1944, the 357th, due to their location, now going by the name the Yoxford Boys, were taking off for yet another escort mission. Only today, the weather was very poor. Visibility was low as a thick fog covered much of the low altitudes, but the mission was still on. As Bud Anderson led his flight, his wingman was a young pilot by the name of Santiago Gutierrez. The second lieutenant was on his 6th mission and was flying on Anderson's right. As the flight was trying to gain altitude and punch through the thick fog over the North Sea, in the blink of an eye, tragedy struck. Another flight of P-51s came out of nowhere, invisible in the fog. The far left Mustang of this group, flown by one of the original members of the 357th, William McGinley, collided with Gutierrez. There was never any time to react, and both planes went down, with 2 good men being killed. Their aircraft crashed into the cold waters of the North Sea, and no bodies were ever found. This was simply a risk of the job, and in 2 combat tours, Santiago Gutierrez would be the only wingman that Captain Anderson ever lost. Roughly 2 weeks later, the 8th Air Force in England unveiled a mission that was to be one of the largest thus far in the war. This would be a major raid to the industrial areas deep inside Germany, involving more than 600 bombers. It was expected that the Germans would answer in force. During this mission, Captain Anderson and the other flights of the Yoxford Boys were flying above the bombers, still a ways out from the target, and far earlier than they normally spotted German aircraft. But on this mission, the radio crackled to life.
Bandits, 12 o'clock.
It was a large force of enemy fighters, barreling head-on at the bombers. For an attack like this, with such surprise, there was nothing the escorts could do. The Germans opened fire and tore through the bombers, sending a few of the B-17s down in flames, and then rolled away to try and set up for a second pass. Now Anderson and the Mustangs dove in pursuit. Quickly, Bud picked out one Messerschmitt in particular and followed him down. An intense turn fight developed, and Old Crow was giving it everything to try and get a shot on the 109. Eventually, the German gave way and took it down to the deck, trying to dive further and escape Anderson. Oddly enough, as he went in after this 109 in the low-level chase, Anderson spotted something in the corner of his eye, a large shadow on the ground. Clearly too large to be a fighter. But at that moment, he had other things to worry about. So he continued the pursuit and tried yet again to get a shot on the Messerschmitt. The chase continued, and the German attempted to pull around and get a shot on Old Crow, but in this dogfight, the Mustang got the edge. Incredibly, thanks to the Anderson family, we have Captain Anderson's actual gun camera footage from this mission, and can watch some of the brief clips of this chase. We can see here the 109 is in a tight chase, but Old Crow is quickly closing in for the kill. Anderson pulls the trigger and fires a good burst, drilling the 109 and landing hits across the aircraft. The German pulls the canopy back and bails, with his plane striking the ground and bursting into flames. This would be the second confirmed kill for Captain Bud Anderson. Here we can see the official combat report filed for this encounter, Lieutenant Simpson listed as the witness, and the kill is confirmed. But by now, the rest of his flight has caught up with him, and Anderson calls out over the radio, "Did anyone see a bomber?" The answer comes back, negative.
So after we finished off the ME-109s, I said to the guys, I was leading the flight, so I said to the guys, "Hey, did anybody see another airplane?" No. I said, "Okay, get in formation so you could look around better." I said, "I think there's something else flying out here." And very shortly after I got them lined up and started looking for the shadow, I saw another shadow. Well, I saw the shadow, and sure enough, it was a Heinkel 111.
Immediately, Anderson begins to look around, trying to find out what the shadow he saw was, and then he spots it, a twin-engine Heinkel HE-111. This aircraft was one of the workhorses of the Luftwaffe in the earlier years of the war, but by now was mostly outmatched in the air and was primarily used as a transport plane. Here, she was easy prey for the 4 Mustangs.
And I thought, holy smokes, here's the opportunity for me to get a fishing barrel. And then I thought, guys in my flight, when I'm leading, didn't get many shots in, or very few opportunities to shoot at the enemy. So I thought, oh Christ, instead of getting an easy kill, I'm going to share this thing with my flight. So I told them, hey, get into gunnery training flights. And that meant they're going to get a shot in. You never saw 3 guys get into gunnery formation so fast they damn near collided, because they knew now he's going to let I'm going to share this with them.
Captain Anderson tells his aircraft in the flight to line up for a standard attack, and then each one of them rolls in, raking the bomber with 50 caliber rounds.
I got the first shot in, got an engine smoking, then they followed up. All 4 of them got hit. My number 4 man was a new guy, and he fired every round he had on his airplane, which meant that his bullets are going around, like they say, burn the barrels out. But I scored all my guys, and I gave them, every one of them at least a hit. So we shared this thing with 4 of us.
Again, we have the real gun cam footage from this very attack, and can see the slow-flying 111 along with its large shadow, desperately trying to escape the P-51s, who have no problem hammering the twin-engine bomber. Following the hits by all 4 members of his flight, the Heinkel tries to crash land, but has a rough go, losing part of a wing in the process and catching fire. Upon turning to look at the downed bomber, Bud sees 2 of the crew members on the ground, one running away and the other standing there, frozen by the plane.
It slid along and broke apart and stopped. Two guys actually got out of the airplane, and one guy was just kind of standing there, looking at us, and we were going around there like angry bees, and he was standing there just looking at us. The other guy took off on a run, and it was so futile because there was no place to hide. It was a gigantic, big meadow, but he wasn't going to hang around there, and he took off on this run. The other guy's just standing there looking at us. And I thought, you dumbass, I'm going to give you a thrill. So I rolled him and gave him right over the top of him, like I was going to shoot him, and pulled up and did a roll and went home.
Here, again, in the gun cam footage, we can see the crashed 111 on the ground, missing a wing and on fire, just as Bud describes. And incredibly, if we look closely, we can even see the two crew members, one running away and one standing by the wreckage of the burned bomber. The combat report once again from this mission can be seen here. Notice that all 4 pilots go through their part in the attack, listing all of the details and confirming the kills shared between all 4 Mustangs. Following this, Bud pulls off and leads his flight back up to the bombers. On their way back up to the formation, Captain Anderson spots one more group of 109s. They engage them again, but this time their ammunition is exhausted. We can see the gun cam footage from this encounter, but Bud Anderson claims this one as a 109 just damaged, running out of ammunition before he can score his 3rd official victory. After this, Old Crow and the rest of the men return to base, and the 4 go on to claim their shared kill of the 111. Here is a photo snapped while the 4 heroes laugh and discuss the quarter victory. From left to right, they are Lieutenant Bill Overstreet, Lieutenant Henry Kaiser, Captain Bud Anderson, and Lieutenant Eddie Simpson. The next few weeks would go on smoothly and mostly uneventful, with Anderson's next major combat coming on the 30th of April of 1944. During this mission, he was leading his flight back home from a routine bomber escort raid with little action, when, as they were nearly over the channel, they spotted something. A small box of B-17s being swarmed by a group of German Focke-Wulf 190s. The fortresses here were clearly in need of help, and so Old Crow and the rest of the flight rolled over and stormed in to help. As they dove in, the 190s turned to hit the Mustangs head-on. Captain Anderson dove in and sprayed his .50 calibers at the bandits, scattering the fighters. He then took Old Crow after one of them as they attempted to make for the deck. He followed closely, and when the target was in his gun sights, let out a few good bursts, striking the Focke-Wulf hard. At this same moment, however, another Mustang flew by, right in front of Anderson. This one had a blue nose, the typical paint scheme of their friendly 352nd Fighter Group. Immediately after the blue nose flew by, the bandit broke apart and bailed out, with his aircraft exploding below. The other P-51 coming in clearly caused some confusion about credit for the kill, as can be seen here in Captain Anderson's combat report, where he states, "I then picked out 2 together and followed, attacking the last man and getting 3 good bursts. He was smoking bad and pieces coming off, and I then had to pull off as I was overrunning him. He straightened out and ran, and then I rolled back and followed. As I closed again, a blue nose P-51 came in very fast and steep in front of me. He pulled up and out, and then the 190 pulled up and the pilot bailed out. I don't know whether or not the blue nose even fired. He was coming in so fast and at such angle that I don't think he could hit him if he did fire. I claim 1 Focke-Wulf 190 destroyed. Captain Clarence E. Anderson." Normally, this would be good enough to cause some confusion and doubt about a kill claim, but fortunately, his wingman and good friend, Lieutenant Eddie Simpson, was there to verify it with his own statement that we can see here. Captain Anderson fired 4 bursts, all of which hit the enemy aircraft very hard. The pilot bailed out, his plane exploded on the ground. A Blue-Nose P-51 also made a pass at the enemy aircraft in a vertical dive, just before the 190 bailed out. I am certain the Blue-Nose P-51 did not hit the enemy aircraft. Signed, First Lieutenant Edward K. Simpson. Thanks to his supporting statement from his wingman, Bud Anderson now tallied his 3rd full kill of the war, and his first 190. The legend of Old Crow was slowly being written. This story of heroism, however, would not be entirely in combat. There were other ways that the Mustang pilots found that they could save lives and aid in the war effort. And it is one mission just like this that Captain Anderson may have had his most unique experience in the war. During this sortie, Old Crow and Anderson were leading their flight back home to England when they located a lone plane over Germany, a crippled B-17 bomber barely in the air, likely riddled from some German fighter. He describes it vividly in his book, To Fly and Fight.
One of the 4 propellers was feathered. It was shot up from stem to stern, enough so that it seemed it would fall to pieces with a good gust of wind. We fell in to guard him, keeping our distance until we were over the water, beyond where the Germans would pursue. There the plane's gunners would know we were friendlies. We closed up on him then, flying formation, close enough that we could see inside the bomber. I couldn't take my eyes off the tail gunner's compartment, or where the tail gunner's compartment had been. It was just twisted metal now. I could see blood on what remained of the glass in the windows.
As they escorted the stricken B-17 home, Anderson began to see how a problem may be developing. This bomber, with significant damage and losing altitude quickly, was barely going to make it across the channel. She would have to certainly land at the first airfield she spotted, and there would be no second passes. As they continued the flight home, the damaged B-17 was nearing the coast, with an airfield now in sight. She looked as if she was barely going to make it, with Old Crow and the other Mustangs watching from nearby. Then, in the distance, Bud spotted something, a B-17 coming in from the opposite direction of the airfield on final approach, with many more bombers close behind. It was clear that these fortresses were coming in to their home airfield from the raid, and had no idea that the stricken bomber was about to have to make an emergency landing. The B-17's radio was obviously shot out, and during this time, the control towers had no radar and operated solely on eyesight. And since, at this moment, they were all looking in the opposite directions at the bombers in the landing pattern, they had not seen the incoming B-17. If nothing was done, the damaged B-17 would likely collide with another bomber in her desperate attempt to land. In the desperate situation, Bud's radio was useless. There was no time to search for the right frequency. He had to act now. Immediately, he pushed the throttle forward and the Merlin engine roared to life, shooting the P-51 ahead of the stricken fortress and towards the runway. In what would normally be something that resulted in harsh disciplinary action, Captain Anderson came in at max throttle and treetop level, buzzing the full length of the runway and going head-on at the approaching B-17, before dropping his flaps and pulling back around. Here he came across the runway again and wagged his wings as he led all of the eyes on the airfield directly towards the crippled bomber. Immediately, the control tower saw and began firing flares into the air to warn off all incoming aircraft to clear the runway. A few seconds later, the damaged B-17 came in, on its belly, sliding to a stop in a rough but safe landing. Emergency trucks came out and tended to the aircraft, and Old Crow and the rest of the flight headed home. Who the bomber was, or what became of its crew, was never determined. It was simply another day on the job for the boys of the 357th. On May 8th, Anderson would meet the Luftwaffe again. This time, it was a flight of Focke-Wulfs that would come in right at the Mustangs from head on. Immediately, Old Crow and the rest of Cement Flight turned and gave chase to the 190s. For a brief moment in this mission, Captain Anderson had a shot on the Bandit. He pulled the trigger and watched his tracers score just a few hits on the fuselage and wing of the German plane. It was by no means what he would normally call a kill shot, and under normal circumstances would not have been fatal. We can actually see these shots and the chase here, in Captain Anderson's gun cam footage from this mission. We can see that the shots do find the target and that a little damage is done before the 190 rolls into a dive where the gun camera footage stops. However, the chase continued, and the Focke-Wulf went into a steeper dive. Captain Anderson and Old Crow were on his tail, trying to get into a position for another shot. However, as the dive continued, he noticed that his airspeed was pushing its limits, so he wisely decided that the best decision was to pull off the chase, rather than to continue after his target. At almost the same moment that he pulled his nose up and lowered his speed, catastrophe struck the 190. Anderson was not able to see this for himself as he was exiting the dive, but fortunately he had his number 3 plane in the flight close behind, Lieutenant Joe Pierce, a seasoned pilot who would score 7 kills in the war. As it was just about to enter a cloud, Pierce watched the tail of the German aircraft tear off from the rest of the plane due to the intense speed of the dive. And this likely occurred because the structure of the plane was compromised because of the hits that Bud had scored a few moments earlier. Here we can read the combat report from this encounter, as well as the supporting claim from Captain Pierce. We can see that Bud admits that he scored very few hits in the chase, but that he did see a big flash in the tail section when he fired. Then the 190 rolled into a steeper dive where he followed for a while and then noticed that the airspeed was close to 600 miles per hour, at which time he let him go and pulled out as gently as possible. Then, however, he mentions that Lieutenant Pierce saw the tail breaking off and catching fire before falling into the clouds, and that he could not actually see this himself. So he mentions that he believes he weakened the tail of the 190, causing it to come off in the steep dive. Lieutenant Pierce's statement confirms, reading, just before the enemy aircraft made it into the clouds, his tail came off, and that he believes this to be the 190 that Cement leader, Captain Anderson, was attacking. Because of these reports, Bud Anderson was credited with yet another Focke-Wulf 190 destroyed, his 4th kill of the war, and one short of becoming an ace. It was a difficult decision to pull off of the Bandit and potentially let him escape, but it was no doubt the right call, as we can see in Bud's report as well, that another pilot, one of the original 28, lost his entire wing from the stress of a steep dive while chasing another 190. He would be killed in the crash. It was choices like this that kept Bud alive so that he could continue to fly and fight. On May 12th, 4 days later, Bud Anderson and the Yoxford boys took off again for another escort raid, this time into Czechoslovakia. This was to try and strike Hitler's oil. This was a significant change in strategy, as up until this point, much of the bombing had been to try and destroy aircraft production. But this was clearly not working. Aircraft factories had simply moved underground, and output was increasing. So they had to change plans and instead go after the Germans' oil, which was much more difficult to hide. Appropriately, the Germans would defend these targets well, and in this raid, the Luftwaffe would strike early and hard, coming down in waves of 30 to attack the bombers. Bud's flight would be pounced by a group of Messerschmitt 109s. They shot at his number 4 twice as the American fighters got into an intense dogfight. As the Mustangs turned and tried to get a shot on the Messerschmitts, other Germans attacked the bombers, sending B-17s to the ground in flames. Old Crow and the other escorts could do little to help. They were themselves trying to stay alive. In a few moments, more American fighters, these being P-47s, also joined the fight and were now in the chase. Unfortunately, though, one of the 109s got a shot on one of the friendly Thunderbolts and pulled the trigger. He tore him apart and the P-47 went down, but this did allow Captain Anderson an opportunity. Just after he had shot down the Thunderbolt, Bud pulled behind the Bandit and had a clear shot. Old Crow had the German pilot dead to rights and was about to fire when suddenly the German pilot pulled the canopy and bailed out before Anderson had ever fired a shot. The plane went down and exploded, but her pilot had exited safely. It seemed bizarre, but in reality it wasn't that outlandish of a strategy. The Luftwaffe at this point had plenty of aircraft, but what they did not have was pilots. It is entirely possible that some of these men could have been directed to save themselves if it came down to it. They were, in fact, over German territory and would likely be back in another plane tomorrow. But if they were shot and killed, there was no tomorrow. It was a strange sight and an even stranger kill that would be added to Bud Anderson's tally. More so, Captain Anderson would have likely loved to adequately avenge the fallen American Thunderbolt pilot, but the German had escaped and lived to fight another day. Following this, Bud's flight would strafe a German airfield and headed back to England. Bud's combat report can again be seen, telling the story of the pilot that bailed before he ever fired a shot, right after downing a Thunderbolt. Again, Lieutenant Pierce's supporting statement can be seen here, verifying Bud's claim. No doubt the pair were becoming close, and with all of the action they were seeing together, they were working well. With this kill on May 12th, Captain Clarence Bud Anderson officially scored his 5th confirmed victory. He was now an ace. It felt strange, as he hadn't even fired a shot at the plane that was his 5th kill, but it counted nonetheless. He was a real ace, with 5 German crosses now on the side of his plane. Also doing well was Lieutenant Pierce, who was now an ace himself, flying as Bud's number 3. Cement flight was on a tear, and things were going quite well. However, this was not destined to last. On May 21st, just 9 days later, Lieutenant Joseph Pierce was strafing airfields and locomotives in preparations for the invasions at Normandy. He was shot down by flak, where he bailed out and was taken prisoner. Shortly after this, though, he was executed while in captivity. He had scored 7 victories and was just 22 years old. Bud Anderson tried to cope by moving on, the best way they knew how. He kept his focus on the next mission, the next target, and the next dogfight. And this, interestingly, would be a massive one. In the coming weeks, Captain Anderson and the Yoxford boys would take part in the preparation and support for Operation Overlord, D-Day. This would be where he would have his greatest success, and likely his greatest trials. All of this in Part 3 of Old Crow, coming soon to TJ3 History.
Making these videos takes countless hours of research, editing, and recording. If you want us to be able to continue to make them, click right here to help save history by joining our Patreon. If you know a living veteran of the Air War, please fill out the form in the description so we might be able to tell their story. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.